But she knew her father, and the numbers made no sense. Digging through old letters, she found inconsistency after inconsistency, signatures that looked forged, all of them benefiting Griffin. Before she could bring her suspicions to anyone with the power to act on them, her carriage was run off a lonely stretch of road. It overturned. Her companion was killed. Marianne survived only because she'd been thrown clear into the trees moments before the carriage went over the embankment. By the time help reached the wreck, the world believed Lady Marianne Calloway had died with it. She made the most dangerous choice of her life. She let them believe it. She cut her hair, buried her name, and vanished into service, certain that if Griffin ever learned she was alive, he would finish what the road had started. Years later, she learned one final piece of the puzzle. Shortly before his death, her father had entrusted certain private papers to an old friend, the late Duke of Ravensworth. That was the real reason Marianne had come to Edmund's estate. Not for a position, not for the Hound, and certainly not for love. She'd come looking for proof that could restore her name. She never expected the Hound from her childhood to be waiting for her there. Caspian had recognized her before anyone else could, and now Griffin was watching, and Edmund was falling for her a little more every single day. The only question left was whether she could tell him the truth herself before the man who'd destroyed her family told it for her. Griffin moved before she found the courage. It started in the library. Late one afternoon, Lady Eleanor walked in unannounced and found Marianne kneeling in front of an old cabinet that had belonged to Edmund's father. She'd barely started searching the drawers when Eleanor demanded to know what a kitchen servant was doing among the family's private papers. Within the hour, Marianne's room had been searched. They found a silver locket first, then a handful of carefully hidden documents bearing the Calloway crest and the name Lady Marianne Calloway. Griffin seized on it instantly. Standing before Edmund, his mother, and half the household, he accused Marianne of something far worse than lying about her past. He called her an impostor who had stolen his dead cousin's belongings and invented a noble identity to hide behind. Edmund barely registered the accusation. He was looking only at Marianne. There was one question he needed answered before anything else mattered. Was Marianne Voss even her real name? She could no longer hide behind the lie that had kept her alive for years. She admitted it wasn't. The admission hit Edmund harder than she expected, though not for the reason she feared. Her noble birth meant nothing to him. What wounded him was realizing that every time he'd opened himself up to her, she had known he didn't even know her true name. Marianne tried to explain. She'd been afraid. She believed Griffin had already tried to kill her once, and revealing herself to the wrong person could cost her life a second time. Edmund still couldn't understand why she'd never trusted him with any of it. Her answer silenced him completely. Trusting powerful men, she reminded him quietly, was exactly how her family had lost everything in the first place. Griffin produced documents of his own, official records confirming that Lady Marianne Calloway had died years earlier in a carriage accident. To anyone unfamiliar with the truth, it looked airtight. The Dowager Duchess finally stepped in and insisted Marianne could not remain at Ravensworth Hall until her identity was properly investigated. Marianne accepted it without protest. She packed the little she owned and left before nightfall. Edmund watched her carriage disappear past the gates. He could have stopped her. He didn't. And that silence hurt Marianne far more than anything Griffin had said. Then Caspian broke free. The Hound tore after the departing carriage and vanished down the road. Hours passed before he returned, soaked through by then, rain hammering the estate, his paws caked in mud, an old leather pouch clenched tight between his teeth. Edmund recognized the seal the moment he saw it. It had belonged to his father. Inside was a letter written by the Earl of Calloway shortly before his death, confirming that certain evidence about the Calloway estate had been entrusted to the late Duke for safekeeping. At the bottom was a warning Edmund couldn't ignore. If anything ever happened to the family, Griffin Ashcombe was to be held responsible. Edmund stared at the page. Marian had been telling the truth all along. But Caspian had brought back one more thing. Tucked behind the letter was an old childhood sketch, a little girl sitting in the grass beside a young hound. Edmund looked from the drawing to Caspian and finally understood. The little girl was Marian. The puppy was Caspian. His hound had never chosen a stranger in the kitchen. He'd simply found his way back to someone he'd loved long before Edmund ever learned her name. Edmund didn't wait for the storm to pass. He had his horse saddled and rode out into the rain with the Earl's letter tucked inside his coat. But Marian wasn't running anymore. For years, fear had decided where she slept,
what name she answered to, how carefully she moved through every room she entered. Leaving Ravensworth Hall had finally shown her that disappearing again would only hand Griffin exactly what he wanted. So before Edmund could reach her, she turned back on her own.
By the time he returned to the hall, soaked through and furious to find her carriage already gone from the road, Marianne was standing in the entrance hall, waiting for him. This time she hadn't come as a servant. She'd come to reclaim her name. Griffin was summoned, along with the Dowager Duchess and Lady Eleanor. Marianne stood before all of them without lowering her eyes. Then she unclasped the silver locket from around her neck. The crowned stag beneath 3 stars had always meant more than a family crest. The locket opened to reveal a tiny folded sheet, account numbers and dates and names copied by hand from her father's private ledger before his death. Edmund laid the list beside the papers Caspian had recovered. The pieces finally fit together. Money supposedly borrowed by the Earl had actually been funneled through accounts controlled by Griffin. Debts had been invented after her father's death. Signatures had been forged. Payments had gone to men connected to the exact stretch of road where Marianne's carriage had been attacked. Griffin denied all of it, but Marianne was prepared this time. Edmund had already sent for an elderly steward who'd served the Calloway family for decades. The man arrived before nightfall, and the moment he saw Marianne, his composure shattered completely. He recognized her instantly. So did Caspian. The old hound rushed toward her with the same joyful certainty he'd shown her that first day in the kitchen.
Whatever doubt remained in the room began to collapse. Griffin saw it too, and he ran. He made it as far as the entrance doors before Marianne stepped directly into his path. For years, she'd imagined this exact moment, imagined everything she'd say to the man who destroyed her family. When it finally arrived, she needed almost no words at all. Griffin hadn't only stolen the Calloway land, he'd stolen her home, her name, her safety, and years of her life he could never return. But he'd failed at the one thing he wanted most. He'd failed to erase her. Edmund's men seized Griffin before he could escape through the doors. The investigation that followed restored everything that had been taken. Marianne's identity as Lady Marianne Calloway was formally recognized, and her father's estate was returned to her. The Dowager Duchess could barely reconcile this truth with the unsuitable kitchen girl she'd once dismissed. Lady Eleanor, oddly, seemed almost relieved. Marianne was noble, after all, which surely made Edmund's attachment to her respectable now. Edmund surprised them both. Her title, he made plain, changed nothing about why he loved her. He hadn't fallen for Lady Marianne Calloway. He'd fallen for the woman with flower on her sleeves, who spoke to him like he was a man before he was a duke. The woman who challenged him, confused him, and somehow made a kitchen feel more alive to him than any ballroom he'd ever walked into.
He would have chosen her exactly the same way, even if none of this had ever come to light. Marianne listened, but she didn't make forgiveness easy for him. Edmund had doubted her when she needed him most, and he knew an apology alone couldn't undo that. So he offered her something harder instead: patience. He admitted his fear had made him retreat behind his pride, and that Caspian had trusted her with more courage than he ever had. That finally pulled the first real laugh out of her since she'd come back. Perhaps, Edmund admitted, his hound simply had better judgment than his master. Marianne didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his, and Edmund finally understood that destiny had never been waiting for him under chandeliers or among perfectly bred women in crowded ballrooms. It had been dragging him by the leash down a servants' corridor, straight toward the woman in his kitchen. In the weeks that followed, Marianne's name was restored publicly, along with everything Griffin had tried to bury. Society reacted exactly as society always does. Some whispered about scandal. Others suddenly remembered they'd always respected the Calloway family. Invitations poured in from people who wouldn't have looked twice at Marianne when they thought she was only a cook. Edmund found the hypocrisy almost funny. Marianne found it exhausting. Neither of them cared nearly as much as they once might have. Edmund made his intentions known before his family, his household, and everyone whose opinion used to matter to him. He intended to marry Marianne, not because she'd regained an estate, not because she carried an old and respected name, and not because marrying Lady Marianne Calloway had suddenly become socially convenient. He chose her because he'd already fallen in love with her back when she was standing in his kitchen with flour on her hands. She didn't accept him right away. Edmund had promised patience, and she made certain he practiced it. But months later, beneath the old trees at Ravensworth Hall, she finally agreed to become his wife. Their wedding was smaller than society expected and warmer than either of them had imagined. When Marianne walked toward Edmund on the morning she became Duchess of Ravensworth, Caspian was supposed to sit quietly beside his handler. He lasted less than a minute before breaking free, hurrying straight to her side, sitting proudly beside her gown as if he'd personally arranged the entire marriage himself. In his own way, perhaps he had. Years earlier, he'd been the puppy who followed a young girl through Calloway Manor, memorizing her voice, her scent, the silver crest she wore, long before Edmund ever understood why the mysterious cook felt so familiar to him. Edmund had spent years convinced destiny would arrive through duty, rank, and careful decisions made in quiet rooms.
Instead, destiny had 4 paws, terrible manners, and an absolute refusal to stay out of the kitchen, and somehow his hound had found his Duchess before Edmund even knew he was looking for her.
Duke Edmund Ravensworth didn't notice his hound had bolted until it was too late. Caspian, normally the calmest animal on the estate, shot across the entrance hall like he'd caught the scent of something he'd been chasing for years. The worst possible night for it. Guests were already filing through the front doors for the evening's dinner, the halls buzzing with servants and candlelight, and here was the Duke's prized hound, deaf to every command Edmund threw at him. He followed anyway. Caspian tore down the narrow servants' corridor and shoved his way into the kitchen, and Edmund braced himself for a disaster, spilled trays, screaming maids, ruined dishes. Instead, he found something stranger. Caspian sat completely still at the feet of the newest kitchen girl, a woman named Marianne Voss, flour dusted across her apron, staring down at the hound with wide, startled eyes. Edmund's irritation cooled into something closer to suspicion. Then Marianne murmured Caspian's name, barely above a whisper, and the hound rose at once, tail wagging like he'd been reunited with an old friend. Edmund went still. Nobody had ever introduced them. Caspian didn't listen to strangers. Not like that. Not ever. But it wasn't the hound's obedience that unsettled him most. It was Marianne's face. She wasn't surprised to see the dog behaving this way. She looked caught, afraid of being seen with him.
And in that single moment, Edmund understood there was a story here neither the hound nor the girl intended to tell him. Edmund had given up on the idea that marriage could bring him any real happiness. He'd watched it happen to his own parents, warmth fading year by year until nothing remained between them but obligation and shared silence at the dinner table. By the time the title and the estate passed to him, he'd quietly decided love was a comfort men like him simply couldn't afford. His mother felt differently. She had already chosen his future Duchess, Lady Eleanor Whitmore, a woman with impeccable breeding, a sizable dowry, and a reputation society adored. Edmund couldn't find a single flaw in her. That, oddly, was the problem. He felt absolutely nothing when he looked at her. Marianne Voss should have been easy to overlook entirely, a new hire in the kitchens, arrived only a month prior with tidy references and almost no personal history to speak of. And yet the longer she stayed, the more her edges failed to match the role she was playing. Her French came too naturally for a servant. She understood the correct order of dinner silver before the head footman did. Once, when the housekeeper stumbled over the wording of a formal letter, Marianne fixed it without a second's hesitation, then went right back to peeling potatoes as if nothing had happened. Edmund started noticing these cracks.
So did the rest of the staff, but Caspian noticed something else, something none of them could name. Every morning, the hound planted himself outside the kitchen door. Every evening, he returned to the same spot, patient as a soldier at his post, as though he were waiting on a routine only he remembered. One afternoon, Edmund came upon them together without meaning to. Marianne was crouched beside Caspian, sneaking him scraps of meat while scratching beneath his chin, right where the fur turned white. The hound's eyes were half shut in contentment, and Marianne was smiling. Not the guarded smile she wore around the household, but something open and unguarded, a smile that changed her whole face. Edmund stopped in the doorway without meaning to. For several long seconds he simply watched her. Then she noticed him. The smile disappeared instantly. She stood, dropped her eyes, and hurried back into the kitchen. Edmund stayed rooted where he was. It wasn't only the mystery of who she really was that bothered him anymore. It was the sudden, deeply inconvenient wish to see that smile again, aimed at him this time. Caspian, it seemed, had decided Edmund was moving far too slowly on his own. A few days later, the hound snuck into Edmund's study, snatched a glove off the desk chair, and vanished before anyone could catch him.
Edmund tracked him straight to the kitchen, where Caspian proudly dropped the stolen glove right at Marianne's feet like an offering. She fought back laughter. Edmund fought back his own. Neither of them won. That night, Caspian refused his supper altogether. The staff swapped his bowl, changed the meat, even called for his handler. Nothing worked. The Hound simply sat facing the kitchen door until Marianne appeared. Only then did he eat, satisfied, as if he'd proven a point. By the third incident, Caspian abandoning Edmund mid-walk to go sit outside the kitchen, Edmund could no longer chalk it up to coincidence. He accused the animal of developing appalling manners. Marianne's mouth twitched with barely restrained amusement, and she offered, without quite saying it outright, that perhaps Caspian simply knew exactly what he wanted. The comment stayed with Edmund far longer than it should have, and slowly the Hound's schemes became unnecessary because Edmund started finding his own reasons to linger near the kitchen. Their short exchanges stretched into real conversations. He learned she loved novels and could talk about poetry without hesitation. She could name a piece of music playing 3 rooms away just from the melody. Once, watching his horse from a distance, she noticed it favoring a leg before his own groom did. Every discovery only deepened the question, where had a kitchen maid learned any of this?
Whenever he got close to asking outright, Marianne found some graceful way to steer the conversation elsewhere. The attention didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the household. One afternoon, a senior servant cornered Marianne and accused her of forgetting her place, of deliberately courting the Duke's interest. Before she could answer, Caspian stepped bodily between them, hackles raised, a low growl building in his chest. Edmund arrived seconds later and ended the confrontation himself, without raising his voice. His presence alone was enough. Marianne looked at him differently after that. Not as a duke giving orders, but as a man who'd chosen to stand beside her without being asked. For one long moment, neither of them looked away. That night, alone in her small room, Marianne pulled a silver locket from beneath her collar. Engraved on its face was a crowned stag beneath 3 stars. She'd barely opened her palm around it when Caspian appeared in the doorway. He crept closer, stared at the crest, and let out a low, aching whine. Something shifted in Marianne's expression. Not surprise, only recognition, heavy and old. As she reached for him, it became clear that whatever bond existed between the Hound and her hadn't started at Ravensworth Hall at all. Caspian had known her long before the Duke ever set eyes on her. Before long, Edmund stopped pretending his visits to the kitchen had anything to do with checking on the dog.
First, it was coffee he claimed he needed. The next day, fresh bread. After that, he simply stopped inventing excuses and admitted he'd come to ask whether Caspian had misbehaved. The staff noticed. Marianne noticed too. Neither said a word about it. One evening, long after the house had gone quiet, Edmund found her alone at the work table, shaping pastry dough beneath the low glow of the kitchen lamps. No Hound between them this time, no servants hovering, no convenient excuse for either of them to walk away. The conversation that followed turned more personal than either of them had planned. Edmund confessed there were nights he envied ordinary men who could marry for love instead of duty, without a title demanding an heir or an alliance or another respectable name stitched onto the family estate. Marianne studied him with the same unsettling honesty he'd come to expect from her. She seemed genuinely baffled by the idea that being a duke should bar a man from choosing his own happiness. Edmund found himself smiling, really smiling, in a way no one else in his life seemed to draw out of him. Marianne suggested that perhaps everyone else was simply too frightened of the title to remember there was a man standing underneath it. That silenced him. When he asked, quietly, whether she was afraid of him too, she hesitated. Sometimes, she admitted. He was about to ask why when footsteps sounded behind them.
Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood in the doorway. One glance told her more than Edmund wanted her to know. Her eyes settled on Marianne, and the warmth drained out of the room instantly. Eleanor made it clear, in that particular tone reserved for servants who'd forgotten their place, that girls who blurred the line between themselves and their employers rarely kept their positions for long. Edmund cut her off before the humiliation could go any further. The speed of his own defense startled Marianne. It startled him more. Later, the Dowager Duchess confronted her son in private. She warned him that affection for a servant girl could curdle into scandal before either of them noticed, and that scandal involving a duke destroyed the woman far faster than it ever touched the man. Edmund insisted nothing had happened between them. His mother's concern was never about what had happened, it was about what might. Only days later, Lord Griffin Ashcombe arrived at Ravensworth Hall. Marianne was carrying a tray through the corridor when he stepped unexpectedly into her path. The tray slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Griffin froze. For one unbearable second, recognition flickered across his face. She lowered her eyes before he could look too closely and gave her name as Marianne Voss. Griffin repeated it slowly, like he was testing it for cracks.
That night, while the house slept, he began quietly digging through the servants' records, because unlike Edmund, Griffin Ashcombe never believed for a second that Marianne was simply a kitchen girl with a mysterious past. He'd seen that face before. Marianne Voss had never existed. Years before she ever set foot in Ravensworth Hall, in a borrowed dress and a borrowed name, she had been Lady Marianne Calloway, the only daughter of the Earl of Calloway. Calloway Manor had once been her entire world, its gardens where she'd learned to ride, its library where she'd learned French and poetry and music, and its kennels where a litter of hunting hounds had been born one spring. Among them was a clumsy black and white puppy who followed her everywhere she went. That puppy was Caspian. But the life she'd known didn't survive long. Her mother died first. Her father followed only months later. And with Marianne still young and the estate suddenly without a protector, Lord Griffin Ashcombe stepped in to manage the family's affairs. At first, he seemed like a blessing. Then the debts began appearing. Ledgers claimed her father had borrowed enormous sums he'd never spoken of. Creditors arrived at the gates. Staff were let go. Land was sold off piece by piece. Before Marianne fully understood what was happening, Calloway Manor had been taken from her entirely.